The NFL ratings are down this year, and everyone's talking about it. Everybody has a reason as to why, including Pete Iorizzo, who joins us from the Times-Union. He is the outstanding columnist, always has a column in the Sunday paper that we react to, and he also happens to be the sports editor of the Times-Union. Good morning, Pete. How are you today?
Good, Rod.
Give me your take here. Your headline is, "Are fantasy sports a drag on NFL ratings?" And by reading your column on Sunday, you think they are.
I do. I felt like when the NFL really started to take off in popularity, I thought just so much of it I thought had to do with fantasy football. And that was what was getting people interested in the league. They weren't necessarily interested in a particular team. They were interested in their fantasy team. But I think in some ways it was sort of a house of cards because the interest wasn't real interest in the NFL and the NFL broadcast. The interest was all in people's fantasy teams. And now that we've got so many ways to check our fantasy teams on our phones, I think for a lot of people, there's really no more need to sit through a 3.5-hour broadcast to watch a product that I think has in some ways gotten difficult to watch with the commercial breaks and penalties. And people just find it easier to play fantasy football without actually sitting through NFL football games. I think that's one reason why ratings are down.
Yeah, there's an estimated, Zach, do you know this number? An estimated 57.4 million people in the United States, and I'm reading from Pete Iorizzo's column in the Sunday paper, 57.4 million in the U.S. and Canada play fantasy sports. According
and that's almost doubled in the past decade. And I don't think it's a coincidence that happened. That if you were to plot that on a graph, if you were to look at the line of fantasy sports participation going up, that you'd see popularity of the NFL going up right alongside it.
And then, Pete, you also reached out to a Fordham University professor who wrote back in 2011 a research paper about the relationship between fantasy football and NFL ratings. What did that tell you?
So he went to look to see if you have a football game going on with a high percentage of players who are on people's fantasy teams. In other words, who are the players most popularly used in fantasy football? Do those games get higher ratings? And he found that there was some evidence that yes, that was the case, and therefore we can hypothesize that there were more people watching these games because they were interested in fantasy football. This was 5 years ago, and it was funny when I talked to him. He said now he agrees with me that he thinks that technology has made it so that 5 years later, a lot of those people who were watching football just to see how their fantasy teams were doing, they no longer need to do that. They could just, they're following on their phones, or if they are watching football, they're watching the Red Zone channel instead of watching a particular broadcast.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense, Zach. I could see where, with what Pete is talking about here in the column he wrote and some of the study and research, that maybe we do have fantasy football guys that are paying attention to, their app or on their phone or whatever, and they're not really watching these whole games start to finish. They only care about whether their quarterback threw how many touchdowns or their running back did what. They're not sitting through a 4-hour game.
Well, Pete, the question I have for you is, and Roger and I have talked about this on the air in recent weeks, I fall back on the fact that, we're in one of the most polarizing, or the most polarizing, election in our nation's history, you could argue, and that is carving into the margins a little bit of the NFL. Does this fantasy football on the macro scale transcend this recent election?
I don't have any evidence to back this up, but I would say it does. I think that you're right. I think they are probably down in part because of the election. If you look at the ratings for cable news, for instance, you see that those are up, and they're up in all the time slots that the NFL is on, like, the prime time slots and then Sunday afternoon. So, you could reasonably conclude, I think, that that's taking some viewers away from football. They're watching cable news and following the elections instead. You had a couple of debates go head to head with the NFL that I'm sure took some viewers away. I'm sure that's got something to do with it. I think things like the national anthem protests, domestic violence, I think that's probably turned some people off and they're tuning out. I think those are probably all factors. But I, for whatever my opinion is worth, I think that the fantasy football factor trumps them all. I think that's a bigger problem for the NFL big picture, because I really do believe you have a generation of fans who, by and large, are not loyal to any particular team, and therefore they don't feel compelled to watch any particular broadcast on any given week. Their real interest is in their own team.
You might be onto something, and you absolutely might be right. We're trying to find out what the rating was last night for Dallas and Philadelphia in the Sunday night, which right now Sunday night football games have dropped 19% in the ratings, and ESPN's Monday Night Football are down 24%, and Sunday afternoon ratings have fallen as well. Pete, I appreciate a few minutes. Good column. Are fantasy sports a drag on NFL ratings? And Pete Iorizzo thinks, yeah, that might be part of the problem. Pete, thanks for a few minutes every Monday here on Big Board Sports.
Okay, thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you, Pete. You too. Have a great week.